Good afternoon and welcome to today's Schiller Institute International Dialogue. A difference of leadership. Can war with Russia still be averted? Mankind has never faced the combination of challenges that we are facing today. Rapidly mutating pandemics, global famine which immediately threatens the lives of tens of millions, worldwide monetary collapse, and geostrategic miscalculations, possibly leading even to thermonuclear war, exist side by side with the capacity for the greatest prosperity in human history. The monumental deliberations actually underway throughout the world cannot be held hostage to intellectual mediocrity, as President Xi Jinping of China said this week at the World Economic Forum at Davos. The world today is undergoing major changes unseen in a century. These changes, not limited to a particular moment, event, country, or region, represent the profound and sweeping changes of our times. As changes of the times combine with the once-in-a-century pandemic, the world finds itself in a new period of turbulence and transformation. How to beat the pandemic and how to build the post-COVID world. These are major issues of common concern to people around the world. So what is this difference between intellectual mediocrity in leadership and true moral leadership? Well, that matter was discussed by Lyndon LaRouche in January of 2004 in addressing a particular breakfast of Democratic Party officials and others during the Martin Luther King weekend. And we are going to play an excerpt from that to have you hear how he described the difference between inspired leadership and mediocrity.
The difference is this, and I'll come back to John Dock, called Joan of Arc in English. The difference is most people tend to believe, yes, I wish to go to heaven, or something like that, or don't care. But they are looking for answers within the bounds of their mortal life. They're thinking of the satisfactions of the flesh, the security they will enjoy between the bounds of birth and death. Whereas the great leader, like Martin, rises to a higher level. They think of their life as the gospel presents it, as a talent. Life is a talent given to you. You're born and you die. That is your talent, what you have in that period. The question is, you're going to spend it anyway. How are you going to spend it? What are you going to spend it to secure for all eternity? What are you going to do as a mission that will earn you the place you want to occupy in eternity? Martin had a clear sense of that. That mountaintop address for me, it struck me years ago, it was just a clear understanding of exactly what he was saying to others. Life is a talent. It is not what you get out of life, it's what you put into it that counts. Martin had that. That's why he was a leader, and I've known the other leaders with him in that period. They didn't quite have the same spark. They may have accepted the idea, they may have believed in it, but it didn't grip them the same way it did Martin. And it came to grip him, I'm sure, more and more as he took on more and more responsibilities. As a leader, you feel this, you see your people. You see the things you have to cope with, the suffering. You see the danger. And you have to find within yourself the strength not to flinch, not to compromise. Take the case of Jeanne d'Arc as the comparison. Joan of Arc, she called. And this is the real history. She was such a significant figure in the 15th century that her history was thoroughly documented at the time and cross-checked and so forth. She was a figure in all Christianity. She was a key figure in the history of France. Here she is, a woman, a young woman, coming from a farming background, who is inspired to believe that France must be freed from the terrible occupation of the Norman chivalry, that France must become a true nation, and that must be risen out of its condition to become a nation to take care of these problems. That God wished this to happen. So she went to a series of events to a prince who was the heir nominally to the throne of France. And she said to this prince, have gotten in there with various credentials, God wants you to become king. And he looked at her and he said, what do you want from me? I said, I don't want anything from you. God wants you to become a king. And so, because of her power of her personality and her mission, the king gave her the command of some troops in a very serious battle at that time, on the assumption that she would be killed as a leader of these troops, and that would settle the whole problem. She wasn't killed. She won the battle, personally leading the battle. And France was mobilized for its independence. The idea of its independence, to a large degree, as a result. Then the time came that the king was crowned, or the prince was crowned king. But then the king betrayed her to the enemies of France, to the British, the Normans. And she was put on trial by the Inquisition, which is a horrible thing. This is the worst kind of injustice you can imagine. And in the course of the trial, she was offered bait. If you will back off a little bit, girl, we won't burn you at the stake alive. And what they did, she said no. She flinched. Maybe I should compromise. She had priests in there trying to get her to compromise. She said, I won't compromise. I cannot betray my mission. She had gone to the mountaintop. I will not betray my mission. I will stay my course. So they took her. They tied her to a stake. They piled the wood on the stake. They set fire to the stake while she's alive. They cooked her to death. Then they opened the pile of wood to see if she was alive or not. They found she was dead. And they continued the process, restarted the fire, and burned her into ashes. But out of that, two things happened. Out of that, France revived and got its independence, and later got the first modern nation state of Louis XI, that is Louis XI of France. And the significance of that is this for us today. Because of that victory, because of what happened with Louis XI of France, we had the first European state in which all of the government was responsible for the general welfare of all of the people. The general welfare means exactly what it means in 1 Corinthians 13, when Paul writes of agape, or sometimes called love or charity. Is that quality? That it is not the law, it is not the rule book that counts. It's your love of humanity that counts, that you must always live for your love of humanity. And therefore, government is not legitimate, except as government is officially committed to the general welfare of not only all of the people, but also the improvement of the condition of life of their posterity. And for the first time in France, with that state, the principle of constitutional law that government cannot treat some of the people as human cattle. It is not legitimate. It is not a nation if it treats some of his people as human cattle. You must think of the general welfare of all of the people. It must be captured by a sense of responsibility to all of the people and to their posterity, because we're all mortal. and to arouse in us the passions while we're alive, which will impel us to do good, we have to have a sense that our life and the consuming of our life, the spending of our talent, is going to mean something for coming generations. The best people look for things that, like Moses, that are going to happen when he will no longer be around to enjoy them. It's this sense of immortality. It's why parents in the best degree sacrifice for their children. It's why communities sacrifice for education for their children, for opportunities for their children. You go the pangs of suffering and shortage, but you have a sense that you're going someplace, that your life is going to mean something, that you can die with a smile on your face. You've conquered death. Your life, you've spent your talent wisely. Why life will mean something better for generations to come. That was the principle. That principle inspired the plan of King Henry VII of England to do the same thing against the evil Richard III and established England at that time as the second modern nation state. In a sense, that's what Martin was doing.
Today, to avoid species-threatening thermonuclear war, will require inspired leadership. Inspired leadership is the leadership of the future, of futurity, but it requires also a culture of futurity. Recently, in the proposal called Operation Ibn Sina, put forward by the Schiller Institute, which is a true solution to the conflict in Afghanistan, we've invoked the great genius Ibn Sina, one of the greatest doctors and thinkers in history. And this challenges all, not merely in that region of the world, to rise to a higher level of thinking about the future not only of Afghanistan or about Asia, but the future of the world as a whole, and a better world. The author of that proposal and several other recent proposals, including, for example, the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites to address the pandemic circumstance, is here to talk to us today. She is the founder of the Schiller Institute and the chairman of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, so that we can maybe figure out if war with Russia can be avoided. Helga?
Yes, hello. I greet all of you. Well, most people are still sleepwalking as to the danger that we are really in a very, very dangerous strategic situation. But on both sides of the Atlantic, more and more people are waking up, and that is expressed in appeals, in varied statements. But naturally, the people in Russia are extremely acutely aware of the situation. And we have to make sure that we get out of this, because if this continues, the existence of civilization hangs by a thread. Let me recount briefly the situation, how we came to this point. On the 21st of November, Avril Haines, the National Director Intelligence Head, went to Brussels to brief the NATO ambassadors about the so-called impending Russian attack on Ukraine, claiming that there was a concentration of Russian troops along the Ukrainian border and that Russia would shortly, probably in January or the latest in February, make an invasion in Ukraine. This was denied by Russia repeatedly, but then on the 17th of December, the Russian Foreign Ministry presented two written draft treaties to the United States and NATO, where they demanded that they wanted to have a written, legally binding guarantee that NATO would no more expand to the east, that there would be no offensive weapon systems put up along the Russian border or the border to Russia, and that also Ukraine would not become a NATO member. Now, the initial response to that was from the side of the United States and also NATO General Secretary Stoltenberg. Absolutely not. Ukraine is a free country. Ukraine has the right to choose its military alliance as it wants to. But basically, Russia has no right to have a spheres of influence. And so the situation became more heated. And on the 7th of December, President Putin and President Biden met in a virtual conference to discuss more on that. And then they had a second conference at the end of December. And, the response so far from the United States and NATO was very effusive, saying all kinds of offers, we are willing to discuss new arms control, but we will not sign these treaties. So in the last several days or in weeks, an absolute hectic diplomatic activity has occurred. The new, very NATO loving German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock went first to Kiev to consult with the Ukrainian government. Then she went to Moscow to talk to Foreign Minister Lavrov. Then Blinken, Foreign Secretary Blinken, went to Kiev. Then he went to Berlin to meet with the foreign ministers of the so-called Quad, meaning Germany, France, the UK, and the United States. Then he met with Chancellor Scholz. Then on Friday, yesterday, Lavrov and Blinken met in Geneva, where basically they had another discussion, and the United States promised that they would give a written answer to these concerning these two treaties next week. Now, Blinken said he would first, consult with the allies and partners, but in a press briefing with reporters afterwards, he said there is no space for the main concern of Russia because the Ukrainian people have the right to determine their own future. Now, there is a lot of wording which is not backed by legal conditions, because, for example, the key standard criteria for new membership of NATO is that if there is a new member in NATO, it cannot threaten the security of the already existing members. And in the case of Ukraine joining, this would clearly be such a case. Then naturally, if you look at the state of democracy inside Ukraine, that is hardly there, given the fact that this was a series of governments which were the result of a coup in 2014. And, as compared to this whole discussion of who is the aggressor in all of this concerning the Russian aggression, I mean, this is a complete falsification of history, because it is absolutely provable through documents which are in the US National Archive, and everybody can read it, that naturally there was no written agreement when the German unification occurred first, and then the Soviet Union dissolved, that NATO would not expand to the east. But there were promises. Then Secretary of State James Baker III, in a famous discussion with Gorbachev on the 9th of February 1990, said NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. And this was repeated several times. There are time witnesses. Genscher spoke about it. Jack Matlock, the US ambassador to Moscow at the time, has said it many times. Horst Telschik, who was the closest advisor of Helmut Kohl at the time. So there is no question that there was the absolute promise given that this would not happen, and the Russians believed it. So when Putin is now saying that Russia feels betrayed, that is absolutely the case. And, I remember very well this period, because this was not an abstraction for us, because we had a peace plan. When this, first of all, my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union in '84, when the then existing Soviet government rejected the offer by President Reagan for collaboration of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And my late husband at that point said, if the Soviet Union stays with that policy, they will collapse in 5 years. Now, we saw the economic decline of the Comecon in '88, and my husband made a very famous proposal for the unification of Germany and Berlin as the capital when in '88. So we had a plan, which we called the productive triangle, how to develop the Comecon countries with Western technologies. And therefore, when the Soviet Union then, or when the GDR collapsed in '89, we were the only force on the ground who had a conception what to do, namely this productive triangle, which was the idea to economically develop the Comecon. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we extended that conception to the Eurasian land bridge, and we deliberately wanted it as a peace policy for the 21st century. And it would have been absolutely possible because the so-called enemy, communism, was no longer there. And it would have been the basis to really establish a completely new order guaranteeing peace. But I also remember in the German newspapers, there were reports about a CIA report in 1991, which said Russia has more raw materials than the United States, and their scientific personnel is better educated than ours. And the combination of these two things means we are not interested in economic development of Russia because they could become a competitor on the world market. So therefore, this economic development should not be encouraged. We know what happened. Jeffrey Sachs, one of the most evil spirits in the so-called field of economics, proposed the shock therapy, which was a brutal slashing of the state-owned industries by going for privatization without any concern for the social consequences. And as a result, the industrial potential of Russia was reduced from 91 to 94 to only 30%. Now, that had tremendous consequences. The demographic curve collapsed by 1 million Russians per year. And, in a certain sense, the population not only of Russia, but of all Comecon countries became extremely impoverished. There was a massive campaign for brain drain, pulling Russian scientists out, which George Soros played a very unfamous role. And so in this situation, then, the NGOs, well-financed NGOs, started to move in, preaching Western liberal values. And, I traveled then many times into Eastern European countries promoting our Eurasian land bridge. And I met many people who said, oh, yeah, sure, there is corruption here. But corruption is a good thing because then you know who is reliable. Now, that was the atmosphere. And, we basically then saw how all of this was leading to the policies of regime change, of color revolution, of, expanding NATO in 3 different waves. And the whole narrative that, it was Russian aggression which annexed Crimea is one of the biggest lies you can imagine because, we followed this extremely closely. What happened was that the European Union, which was sort of an adjunct to NATO, wanted to get the Ukraine into the EU association agreement by the end of 2013. And when Yanukovych realized that this would absolutely not agree with the interest of Ukraine, that it would open the Black Sea for NATO, that it would give EU exports unrestrained access to Ukrainian and Russian markets, which both economies would not be able to cope with, he withdrew from that in the last moment. And then you had the mobilization of the NGOs on the Maidan, for which, according to Victoria Nuland, the State Department had spent $5 billion. And very quickly, these demonstrations were infiltrated by terrorist elements which came from ISIS and similar terrorist groups from the Middle East. And then in February 2014, you had the famous Nazi coup with support from Victoria Nuland, who bragged about it in a telephone call, and she distributed cookies on the Maidan. So there was a fascist coup. The new government forbid the Russian language and started to move against the Russian population. And then you had a vote of the population of Crimea saying that they wanted to belong to Russia, which they had belonged to until 1954 in any case. So there was no annexation by Putin. There was a vote by the people of the Crimea. If the people in Kosovo have that right, which was the result of the NATO war against Yugoslavia, then the double standard, should not be applied to the people of Crimea. In any case, these tactics to try to change governments with means of color revolution, of coercing people, of bribing people. The last time this was attempted, just a few weeks ago, in Kazakhstan, President Putin correctly said what was used there were the Maidan techniques, and that Russia will never again allow that to happen. So the whole narrative about who brought the situation to this point is completely upside down. And when Russia has now moved more than 100,000 troops to the border with Ukraine, which, by the way, are not closely to the border. Many of these troops are hundreds of kilometers away from the border. This is, according to several military experts from Europe, not reflecting the intention of Russia to attack Ukraine. Absolutely not, but it has been done as a threatening backdrop to force the discussion. And this is exactly what has happened. Now, right now, despite these negotiations going on in Geneva, then in Brussels last week, and also in Vienna, nevertheless, the British are moving lethal weapons to Ukraine. They have moved 30 special forces from the Army Special Operation Brigade into Ukraine to train people of the Ukrainian armed forces. And the U.S. also has allowed the Baltic states to export weapons they have bought from the United States to Ukraine, which for sure is not calming down the situation. So what President Putin has said is that if there is no response by the United States and by NATO, then he will employ military technical measures. Now, only Russia knows what they are, but an expert with the name of David T. Pine, who works with the Homeland Security in the United States, wrote recently a very insightful article in the National Interest, where he muted, and quoting also another expert, Doktorov, that what could possibly happen in response to this perceived threat from the side of the Russians. They could mobilize the SS-26 Iskander-M short-range missiles, nuclear missiles, to Belarus and to Kaliningrad. And that would be an immediate threat to troops and military equipment of the NATO frontline states, and naturally also Eastern Germany, and at the same time move the Zircon, the new Zircon nuclear-capable cruise missile before the coast of Washington. And the warning time for such a deployment, according to previous Russian statements, would be shorter than the president would need to get into Air Force One. Now, just imagine what this has brought the world to. You have NATO and there are 10,000 NATO troops in Ukraine already now, 4,000 of them being Americans. You have heavy weapon systems, and if a system is offensive or defensive, is it's a matter of where the battle is. Some weapons are defensive at one moment and they become offensive at another moment. So this is very difficult to differentiate, and most of these weapons have dual possibilities. So this would, if it comes to that, it would mean we have a double Cuban Missile Crisis, and then the statement by the 5 permanent member of the UN Security Council, who recently, in a very laudable way, confirmed the famous statement that a nuclear war can never be won and therefore must never be fought, that would not be worth much. Now, this is why the Schiller Institute is calling for a new security architecture, because this idea of expanding NATO to a global NATO to contain Russia and China, and at the same time, insist, as it was demonstrated by this summit for democracy, which President Biden conducted in December, that the United States and NATO and the Western countries are the only ones who can determine what a global rules-based order is simply totally outside of any reality. First of all, you have a rising China, you have a military alliance between Russia and China, or a very strong partnership for sure. You have more than 150 countries who want to cooperate in the Belt and Road Initiative, because that is what overcomes poverty and underdevelopment. And you already have a multipolar world. Even Chancellor Merkel, who for sure was an Atlanticist, she insisted that a multipolar world is already a reality, and she did not want to choose between either the United States or China. And so are many countries in the world who do not want to choose. They want to be in a new system of international relations which cooperates for the development of all. So I suggest very strongly that we need a new security architecture, which has to reflect on the basic lessons of history. I mean, you have to look at treaties which did lead to peace and those which didn't. A good example for the first is the Peace of Westphalia, where after 150 years of religious war, especially the 30 years of war, people realized that nobody would be the winner of the continuation of the war. So they agreed on the famous principles of the Peace of Westphalia, the most important of which being is that you have to take into account the interest of the other if you want to have peace. Now, every time that was done, and this Peace of Westphalia, by the way, was the beginning of international law and what constitutes the UN Charter today, that leads to peace. The other example, the Versailles Treaty, which assumed or basically proclaimed that Germany was the only guilty party in that war, which was not true. And for sure, it was not just. And it put burdens on Germany to pay not only the cost of war, but reparations, which was completely overburdening the German economy. So the Reichsbank started to print money that led to the hyperinflation that contributed to the depression. And naturally, the deep sense of injustice, which the people coming out of this had, led to the rise of the Nazis and the actual takeover of the National Socialists, and that led then naturally to World War II. So if there's any lesson to be learned from these two models of the Peace of Westphalia or the Versailles Treaty, one has to absolutely insist that the new security architecture, which absolutely urgently must be built, must take into account the security interest of every participating country, including that of Russia and China. Now, that brings me to the last point, that obviously, if one looks at the cause of war, why are we in this dangerous situation? It is because the financial system is on the brink of collapse, as you can see, by the incredible debt which has been built up, especially since the many trillions were pumped into the system after the systemic collapse in 2008. And naturally, the hyperinflationary tendency which you see right now in the price of energy, the price of food, basic raw materials, is, if we continue on that, we will go for a social explosion on a worldwide scale people have not even an inkling about. So we have to address in this new architecture also the need to have a new credit system, a new Bretton Woods system, with the main aim to overcome the poverty and underdevelopment of all people who are in that condition worldwide, and that way contribute to a stable economic growth as being the platform for all countries to cooperate and dedicate themselves to the common aims of mankind. Now, some may think that this is utopian, and I'm telling you, this is the only realistic perspective, because the alternative to this is nuclear extinction, and then there will be not even an historian left to investigate why we came to this point. So this is what I wanted to say.
We can't hear you, Dennis.
Okay, how about now? Is that all right now? Can you hear me now? Okay. So, I apologize for that. So thank you, Helga. And if you just joined us, we're here for the International Dialogue of the Schiller Institute. A difference of leadership. Can war with Russia still be averted? What I want to do right now is to bring up everybody else that's going to be participating with us today. And that includes Harley Schlanger, Vice President of the Schiller Institute, Paul Gallagher, co-editor of the Executive Intelligence Review Economics Desk, and Richard Black, who is the Schiller Institute UN representative. So what we're going to do before we go to them is to hear a presentation that was prepared for today by Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky, the first Deputy Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations.
Dear colleagues, my name is Dmitry Polyansky. I am the first Deputy Permanent Representative of Russia to the UN. I would like to thank the Schiller Institute and Ms. Helga Zepp-LaRouche for inviting me to speak at today's conference. The news about our proposal for security guarantees and the negotiations with the West are hitting the headlines. So you can hardly imagine a more timely topic these days. I appreciate this opportunity to share my views from New York perspective. I would like to start on a cautiously optimistic note. Our dialogue with the US, NATO, and OSCE is ongoing. As I speak now, our minister is meeting with State Secretary Blinken in Geneva as a follow-up to earlier contacts in January. So we meet and we talk. I don't have any doubt that this is a kind of positive development compared to the stalemate we used to be in for the past few years. The value of these contacts should not be underestimated. Some time ago, that could even be viewed as a result itself. However, the reality is that these times have passed. Talking is clearly not enough now, with all gentlemen's agreements repeatedly violated by our Western counterparts. Our national security interests are faced with a direct threat as the NATO countries' military build-up around our borders. Therefore, this time we do not expect lengthy discussions, but rather very concrete response from our Western colleagues with regard to the proposals on security guarantees we put on the table. As you know, last December we passed to the US side two drafts, Russia-US Treaty on Security Guarantees and the Agreement on Measures to Ensure the Security of Russia and Members of the NATO. The ideas in these drafts do not come out of thin air. They are based on previous agreements, including those of the OSCE summits in Istanbul in 1999 and in Astana in 2010, stating that the OSCE members will not strengthen their own security at the expense of the others. No state, no group of countries or organization can be vested with primary responsibility for maintaining peace and stability in Europe. This is an integral part of the compromises and decisions made at the highest level in the OSCE, and our Western counterparts must fulfill their part of these obligations. In a nutshell, we seek written, legally binding, ironclad guarantees for the following: that the NATO will not expand eastwards, that no assault weaponry will be deployed close to the Russian territory, that the military infrastructure in Europe will be brought back to the parameters prescribed in the 1997 Foundation Act between Russia and the NATO. These are our red lines, and our colleagues in the West are well aware of that. We expect to receive as soon as possible written, clause-by-clause comments to our proposal for this strategic initiative, not to get bogged to endless and fruitless discussions. Unfortunately, our Western colleagues are trying to descale the whole issue to Ukraine. It seems at times that they are in a way self-hypnotized with the imminent threat of the Russian invasion. It is something irrational, self-inflicted phobias. Something to be discussed in a therapy rather than in a serious political circle. It also seems that our Western colleagues are blinded by the victory, so-called victory in the Cold War, and continue to leave these memories and try to talk from the position of superiority and impose double standards. They blame us for the presence and movement of our troops on our own sovereign territory, while claiming that everything they do on the NATO territory is nobody's business. This will no longer work. On the destabilizing activity, this is exactly what the West is doing in Ukraine, sending more and more weapons and troops there, spurring its militarization. Instead of encouraging Kiev to comply with the Minsk package of measures and its other international obligations, our Western partners encourage Kiev bloodthirsty looks to Donbass, since it sees Western so-called assistance as a carte blanche. The year has only started, but according to the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, the number of ceasefire violations has already exceeded 3,000. But the real problem is way bigger than Ukraine. The whole architecture of regional security in Europe is almost ruined. The situation is escalating, and contrary to Western narrative, all threats come from the West rather than Russia. They, on a daily basis, try to intimidate us by sanctions, grave consequences, you just name it. It is not something new. Russia has been resisting various threats for centuries. So we learned how to handle this. I hope our Western colleagues will be good students of history as well. We should not repeat the mistakes of the past, and we still have a chance to focus on what unites us rather than divides. I wish your conference success and fruitful continuation of your work. Thank you very much.
So Helga, before we go to Harley, I wanted to ask you if you had any comment on what Ambassador Polyansky has just said.
Well, I think he just confirmed the general interpretation of what I said earlier, so I have nothing more to add at this point.
Okay, fine. So Harley, why don't we hear from you now?
Hello. Okay. Well, I want to add a little bit to the picture that we got from Helga and from Ambassador Polyansky. And what I will show is that the U.S. official position that it's Russia that's the cause of the problem and Russia has to back down, Russia has to move back its troops and so on, is either based on ignorance of history or an arrogant view of the U.S. as the unilateral enforcer of a rules-based order. And what I intend to show is that it's the latter. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said the other day that ignoring Russia's legal concerns over the eastward expansion of NATO to include Ukraine and the deployment of forces, including weapons, near the border, will have the most serious consequences. Now, in stating this, he was repeating the formulation that I think is the most clear from President Putin from his annual press conference on December 23rd. And I want to read the quotes from President Putin. He said, "Our actions will not depend on the negotiation process, but rather on unconditional guarantees for Russia's security concerns. In this connection, we have made it clear that any further movement of NATO to the east is unacceptable. Is there anything unclear about this? Are we deploying missiles near the U.S. border? No, we are not. It is the U.S. that has come to our home with its missiles and is already standing on our doorstep. Is it going too far to demand that no strike systems be placed near our home? What is so unusual about this?" Now, in listening to that, it's very striking the similarity to the argument made to the American people on October 22nd, 1962 by President Kennedy as to why he had to adopt a quarantine, which was actually a blockade of Cuba, to stop the import of further Soviet missiles during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here's what Kennedy said in that speech to the American people. He said, "In the world today, due to the destructive power of nuclear weapons and the swiftness of ballistic missiles, any substantially increased possibility of their use or any sudden change in their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace." After developing that a little bit more, he talked about the buildup of the Soviet Union's missiles in Cuba. And he said, "This is, quote, in an area well known to have special and historical relationship to the United States." And I might add parenthetically, exactly as Ukraine does with Russia today. He went on to say the sudden clandestine decision to station strategic weapons outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country. I think you'll see in his language something very similar to what President Putin is saying today, which is why many people, including Helga, have called this a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I want to just give you a quick view of what the idea of a unipolar world is and what it's meant, because the people who argue for the U.S. to be the main power start from the standpoint that we're democratic, we're good, therefore, when we deploy missiles, it's for the good. And as Dr. Andrei Kortunov told us, when you, the Russians, deploy the missiles, since you're bad, these are bad missiles and have to be opposed. Now, from that standpoint, we have to look at where this idea comes from. But let me say the underlying issue today, which is called to question by President Putin's insistence on legally binding security guarantees, is that the construct of the unipolar world is dead. The whole idea that there's only one nation on the planet, because of its immense military power and economic power, can dictate the rules to the rest of the human race and use satraps such as the European Union and NATO to help enforce it, no longer applies. The Western financial system, as I think Paul will go through, is collapsing. So there's a further point, though. In reality, this idea never really existed, except in the minds of those who enforced it and tried to convince the rest of the world that you had no choice but to accept it. They believed that the collapse of the Soviet Union left them with no military obstacle to impose their unilateral decisions on strategic and financial economic matters. So we've talked about this before. Helga brought it up again this afternoon. What is the rules-based order? Well, for the unilateralists, it's the rules that sustain their control over the global economy. Now, this goes back to a merger during the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, and actually before that. It occurred during the Reagan administration with the emergence of the Democratic Leadership Council taking over the Democratic Party with a so-called third way approach, which became the approach of the Clinton administration. The idea of the neoconservatives and neoliberals essentially joining as an American force to impose this unipolar world. In particular, it was the neocons who were the most arrogant with their project for a new American century, in which they insisted that the United States had emerged as the only power on the planet, and therefore they created a narrative to explain why everyone else has to march to the tune of the United States. The narrative starts with, "We won the Cold War." Second, the Cold War, the victory in the Cold War was one of democracy and the free market. The third point, this means that every nation must submit to those who won the Cold War because we're the good guys, we did what was right. And the fourth point, which is usually not expressed, is that this means there's no more sovereignty, no more peace of Westphalia, as Tony Blair blatantly stated repeatedly in trips to the United States, that to the idea that there's a common good is no longer acceptable. The idea that interference in other nations' other nations' internal affairs, which was part of the Peace of Westphalia, is no longer valid. That the common good is what the unipolar powers insist on. Now, I want to give you a sense of what the so-called democratic order, this rules-based order, has done in the world in the last 30 years. Jose, if you could put up the graphic, please. You start with, and this, by the way, is just a partial picture, but it's some of the more outrageous examples. Start with the Panama invasion under George Herbert Walker Bush on December 20th, 1989, on completely fraudulent, trumped-up charges. Then January 17th, 1991, the United States launches Desert Storm, the initial invasion of Iraq, again, on totally spurious charges, unjustified activity, but nevertheless, they went in, and fortunately, they stopped short of Baghdad, but that was something that was taken up again later. March 24th, 1999, the United States and NATO began a bombing attack on Yugoslavia. This was thought to be the argument was this is to protect Europe from the genocide being committed by the Serbian forces. There are many questions still outstanding on this, but the obvious point is that there were extremely destructive bombing raids, both in terms of human lives and destroying infrastructure, done by the United States and NATO in Europe. Then October 7th, 2001, the US under the younger Bush and NATO launched the invasion of Afghanistan, which just ended this last summer. 2003, March 20th, the US invaded Iraq, again on phony pretenses. The idea that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction. This case in particular was concocted by British intelligence and by networks in the CIA that were committed to destroying the government of Saddam Hussein. March 15th, 2011 marks the beginning of the Syrian civil war. This occurred at a point where the decision had been made by networks in the United States and Europe that Assad had to go, there had to be a regime change in Syria. Over time, as the jihadist forces of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, al-Nusra were conducting slaughter of the Syrian people, the United States was arming and training them as moderate Syrian rebels. This destruction in Syria continues to this day through the sanction policy, the Caesar sanctions, which are threatening the lives of hundreds of thousands of Syrians, especially children. Now, 4 days after that, March 19th, 2011, the US under Obama, along with France and the United Kingdom, launched the bombing of Libya, which ended with driving Gaddafi from power and murdering him, which was greeted joyfully by a cackling Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. And then February 22nd, 2014, the successful conclusion of the Maidan Square regime change coup in Ukraine, which was a phase, an escalated phase in the targeting of Russia. Now, there's another aspect of this, if you can go to the next one, which is the U.S. rejection of part of the strategic architecture, the security architecture, which was part of the post-war world to guarantee that or to reduce the danger of nuclear war. In December 2001, President George W. Bush announced that the U.S. was getting out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And then on August 2nd, 2019, Donald Trump did the same, saying the United States was leaving the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, the so-called INF. Now, then you have the famous statement from March 25th, 2014, again, demonstrating an arrogance toward the government and the people of Russia, where President Obama said of Russia, quote, "Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness." This was a reference in particular to Ukraine and the events in Crimea. Now, there's one other aspect of this, which Helga mentioned, and I just want to emphasize briefly because it's a part of the same picture. After the first Iraq War, the United States policy toward Russia became that of enforcing a so-called economic transition through something called shock therapy. Now, the shock therapy doctrine was a product of the neoliberal Chicago school associated with so-called Austrian school economist Milton Friedman. The idea that the way you bring a country to stability is crush the labor force, lower wages, and destroy unions and destroy political parties. In other words, impose a dictatorship, exactly as Lyndon LaRouche warned on August 15th, 1971, that the intention was to use these Schachtian austerity policies to destroy nations. The Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, with the neoliberal reforms under the Chicago boys of Friedman, was the first step in this direction, and it proved to be a complete catastrophe, destroying the standard of living in Chile. And we now see a government coming into Chile that's committed to completely overturning the last remnants of that neoliberal policy. Well, in 1992, the shock therapy doctrine was applied to Russia under then President Boris Yeltsin. It was run by Harvard economists associated with Jeffrey Sachs, with bankers from New York, Boston, and City of London. It included people like Bob Strauss, the Democratic Party fixer, Bill Browder, the swindler who came in through hedge funds to loot Russia. But the policy of shock therapy was designed to destroy what was there of a Russian industrial and scientifically oriented economy and replace it by making Russia into something modeled on a third world raw material exporting country, with the wealth in the hands of Russian oligarchs who were working with the Western bankers. Just two indications of what this meant for the Russian people. In January 1992, when it was first implemented, and they lifted the price controls, retail prices rose 245% in that month. And for the year 1992, retail prices increased 2,500%. Along with the deindustrialization and the loss of living wages and the inability of the government to protect the social welfare, there was a dramatic increase in the death rate and a lowering of the average life expectancy over the next decade, which was only reversed in the most recent period. But that began with the Putin presidency in 2001, or 1999, I'm sorry. It took a while to reverse it. It's still underway to being reversed. Now, what's the reaction to what Putin did to overcome the effects of demographic collapse, of the looting of Russia? Well, you have people such as Bill Browder and newspapers such as the London Guardian, and now the line from everywhere: Putin's an authoritarian, he's an autocrat. There's no democracy in Russia. And anyone who says anything that the Russians are raising legitimate security concerns is called a Putin apologist. The attacks on Biden that you see coming out in the press, that Biden is weak, that Biden may be the Neville Chamberlain giving in to Putin as Hitler. This was furthered with the so-called Summit of Democracy, which tried to force the narrative that the West is democratic and Russia is not, China is not. And therefore, we have to stand firm to defend the democratic institutions and sovereignty of Ukraine. Well, just one simple point here. This is the height of hypocrisy. Where was that concern for the sovereignty of Ukraine, for the legitimacy of Ukrainian elections, when the US ran the coup in February 2014? How is it reflecting the interests of the Ukrainian people when that revolution, so-called, that regime change coup, brought in the International Monetary Fund and lowered the standard of living of the people of Ukraine dramatically? And where is that concern when Ukraine becomes the potential staging area for a World War III provoked by NATO and the Western powers, when it would be very simple to sign the draft treaties proposed by President Putin and move on to a bigger concern, which is addressing the pandemic, addressing food shortages worldwide, the global hyperinflation, and so on. So the point is that the era of the unilateralists is over, whether they know it or not. We see it with the rise of Eurasia. But the continuing attack on Russia and China is the revenge of the geopolitical doctrine of Mackinder from the late 19th century, which says there can never be an alliance between Western and Central Europe with Eurasia. And the emergence of Russia and China as an economic power, not as a military power, but as an economic power, is the threat that's being addressed, or being attacked, I should say, by the Western policy toward Ukraine. So that's what I wanted to present and open for discussion.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Harley. We're going to hear from Paul Gallagher from our economics desk of Executive Intelligence Review here, and just point out, as we begin to hear from him, that when you look at the United States today, we have almost 900,000 people that have died of coronavirus. We'll be at 1 million. You have massive increases in the mortality rate, lowering of the life expectancy, and so on. And one thing that I just want everybody to think about as he goes through his report is that Lyndon LaRouche was the leading economist in the world. And he always emphasized to all of us that the issues that you're seeing reflected in the areas of policy, diplomacy, war, and peace are always fundamentally issues of physical economy. So, Paul, good to see you. Let's go.
Thank you, Dennis. On the threat of global financial breakdown now and the threat of war, let me just go back into some fast review of the history of this. The United States and the European nations have been in waves of deindustrialization since the Bretton Woods system was destroyed in the early 1970s. And in place of that industrial production, financial speculation from that point became much more profitable and flourished. And since the 1980s, under this floating exchange rate casino international monetary system, the resulting debt bubbles have repeatedly crashed and have been rebuilt by the major central banks through easy money policies. In the worst of these crashes, which was the 2007-08 global financial crisis, the so-called Great Recession, the proposals from LaRouche's movement to break up the biggest banks and write down the speculative debt and build new industrial infrastructure worldwide were rejected. They were blocked. To save the mega banks, instead, the Federal Reserve and the other central banks went for zero interest rate policies, and they wrote really new rules for printing money, for quantitative easing, as they called it, The central banks were providing Wall Street and the City of London with masses of new reserves for speculation, while the big banks refused even to make promises that they would lend any of these masses to the real economy, let alone did they do so. This built up a mass of increasingly unpayable debts like nothing ever had before, especially corporate debts. The everything bubble, as they call it, is now $275 trillion in size worldwide. In the United States economy alone, it is $65 trillion. It is 3 times as large relative to GDP than in the 1970s, and that's relative even to the highly overstated GDP of modern accounting. The everything bubble, as they call it, began to break apart in mid-2019 when a crisis erupted in the interbank lending markets. A major European service firm went bankrupt, and in mid-September 2019, the big Wall Street banks began refusing to make overnight loans to European banks or to the hundreds of hedge funds which depended on these overnight loans for their very survival. So the central banks and the private bankers in August of that same year, 2019, had determined to create inflation, and specifically inflation against the dollar, which denominates the largest burden of this unpayable debt. This call for inflation was given by the head of the Bank of England at that time, Mark Carney, the financial enforcer at the same time of the green finance for the Green New Deal, for which he's become infamous. And that inflation call was also given by a bunch of bankers from the BlackRock Incorporated, the largest financial firm in the world. They spelled out a policy of helicopter money, which they called regime change. Central bank inflation is the way that central bankers get rid of debts that can't be paid while providing the means to loot new areas and new economic sectors. See on this Weimar Germany and Nazi Germany, the central banking practices of Hjalmar Schacht. So from mid-September of 2019, the Federal Reserve suddenly loaned $1 trillion to the banks in 6 months' time. Then from March 2020 to now, $7 trillion in money printing by the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank combined in less than 2 years. Now, they have set off the inflation that they wanted and more than that. And along with it, the Green New Deal or the Great Reset. They are trying to pour trillions in investments, much of the newly printed, into supposedly new or actually throwback technologies for power production, industrial production, agriculture, transportation, heating, etc., while writing off fossil fuel and nuclear industry debts and assets to the tune of $500 billion in the last 2 years. Nonetheless, according to the Financial Times, 2 years ago, that was not nearly enough. At least $900 billion in fossil fuel assets alone had to be written off immediately, according to the Financial Times, in February of 2020. So this policy of shutting down productive but indebted industries while creating rapid inflation does tremendous injury to populations, to businesses, to nations, which are going along with it or are being coerced to allow it. It has spread poverty worldwide. The progress against poverty made up through the last decade has been reversed, despite China's poverty elimination. But the big failure of the United Nations Global Green Summit in Glasgow, Scotland in November showed just how strong the resistance to this green looting policy actually is. It was called at that conference climate colonialism by the developing countries, whose fossil fuel industries were being disinvested and shut down. Their nuclear power ambitions were being blocked. And China and Russia and even India were seen as leading that resistance. Because of the strength of that resistance, Russia and China are targets of the geopoliticians getting their financial imperial policies from the City of London and Wall Street. The enemy image of Russia and China is intended to shut down an alternative growth policy and make other nations accept the most painful hyperinflationary economic breakdowns. Just look at Europe, which is even blaming the energy hyperinflation from which they're suffering on Russia in an absurd manner. Lyndon LaRouche, in a 2011 webcast, speaking about the overthrow and assassination at that time of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, very presciently said that the target of the series of regime change wars was Russia, and what they threatened was world war. He said that the cause of the crisis of these wars was the payments crisis, the economic and financial crisis of the perpetrators who were being directed from London. What the British want, LaRouche said at that time in mid-2011, is to win such a war with Russia and China by one means or another, and then, quote, write off their debts and go about their business, although human populations in the world will be reduced by hunger and disease. And that's what I've been describing. Now, this doesn't function because the scientific, technological, and economic strength of the effective partnership of China and Russia keeps increasing relative to that of the UK and the US, who are threatening war or a deep new Cold War. And the world takes notice of this and assesses, in a case of such a new Cold War, who would prevail. So the most effective action for peace that the targets of this war policy can take would be to start the path back to that Bretton Woods system, which was destroyed by actions of President Nixon and by the London banks in the early 1970s, to initiate that as a Eurasian agreement for a new global monetary and credit series of agreements, and to invite the United States to join as a critical partner and to direct it towards the immediate reversal of the destruction, the war destruction of nations such as Afghanistan, and particularly reversing the incredible injury and damage and threatened starvation and death through disease in the nation of Afghanistan. To give such a new international credit system such objectives, to invite the United States into it, plays to the strengths which are demonstrated right now by the economies of China and Russia, technological, scientific, as well as dynamic economic strengths, and is a policy against the cause which is driving this threat of war. So that's what I wanted to present.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul. And just want to announce, because people are asking, yes, we are taking questions. I think we've had the banner up a couple of times. We do welcome them. We're going to go to Richard Black, who is the Schiller Institute representative at the United Nations. Then we'll be opening up for the general discussion and answering questions at that point. So, Richard, go right ahead.
Thank you, Dan. I'd like to comment on some of the ideas put forward today to us by Ambassador Polyansky of the Russian Federation. Ambassador Polyansky has characterized the US and NATO as self-hypnotized by the so-called imminent threat coming from Russia. He characterized this delusion as derived from irrational self-inflicted phobias, something to be discussed in a therapy session rather than in a serious political circle. He concluded his remarks to us by saying that all threats are coming from the West, as they have for centuries, and that Russia has studied history, and he hopes that the West will also be good students of history and focus on what unites us rather than divides. And I think this is a very important principle Focus on what unites us rather than divides. I want to point out that a great and deadly robbery is being carried out right now, and it's being inflicted by the war party's intelligence community, think tanks, media, and it's a robbery against the populations of the US and Western Europe by the daily barrage of pre-war propaganda, demonizing Russia. And this is an attempt to prepare you for a coming war with Russia. What is being robbed of you is the knowledge of the past and present great contributions of Russia to universal knowledge, what Lyndon LaRouche named the spirit of Russia's science. Lyndon and Helga LaRouche participated in a great many scientific and national policy discussions in Russia at the Academy of Sciences, in leading universities, and in the State Duma. Mr. LaRouche described, in his words, Russia's role as a nation of science. He described each nation as having special characteristics, special unique contributions, and he talked about Russia as a nation of science, which in fact contributed many geniuses to world science as a whole. I can name Mikhail Lomonosov, whose circle was in active collaboration with Benjamin Franklin on matters of electricity, atmospheric phenomenon, and exploration. Dmitry Mendeleev, the discoverer of the harmonic laws among the chemical elements, something which every chemistry student in high school and college around the world knows as the periodic table. And Vladimir Vernadsky, the genius who revolutionized our understanding of the biosphere and the noosphere, that domain of man's creative cognitive action. And just over 20 years ago, academician Yevgeny Primakov, the visionary Russian prime minister who foresaw, as did LaRouche, the coming economic integration and the cultural dialogue of the great nations of all of Eurasia. Are you familiar with those names? I hope so, in which case I say revive your studies. If you are not familiar with those names, realize that you have been deprived of an entire wonder-filled and critical facet of mankind's development. There have been many periods in the past of immense collaboration amongst Russia, the United States, Western Europe. That's the rule, not the exception. As Helga Zepp-LaRouche has shown, that collaboration must be revived now on an emergency basis to stop the murder of the people of Afghanistan. Required is immediate, massive, coordinated aid in the form of food, medicines, medical personnel, and protection from the winter cold, and simultaneously the reconstruction of the infrastructure to sustain life and productivity, beginning with an emergency building of a national healthcare system in Afghanistan. This Helga LaRouche has named Operation Ibn Sina. I believe that this can be done if governments in the West are forced by us to give up their self-inflicted phobias, as Ambassador Polyansky referred to them clearly today, and to reclaim what is in fact a natural and history-based friendship between the US, Russia, and China. I think that Ambassador Polyansky's call to focus on what unites us is very wise advice, especially in this extremely dangerous time. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Richard. And so what we're going to do now, we have several questions. A lot of them are from young people who are interested in the topic, and we're going to go to those in just a minute. Jose, if we can just put the map up there for a moment, because that was one of the requests that came in from the questions. They just wanted to make sure we had a map of the area so that people could see, which I think is a good thing. And you see there to the left, particularly the border of Ukraine with Russia. And then you see above that Belarus, which is there in the blue. And then above that, particularly Latvia and Lithuania. It's not so entirely clear to be able to read that along the map there. The lighter colors, you see Finland fairly clearly identified. It's important to recognize that, as if I'm correct, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, that both Latvia and Estonia are members of NATO, first of all, just so people are clear that there are NATO-based member countries on the border of Russia already. And of course, if you look there in the lower part of the map, where you're seeing, not entirely clearly, but Kazakhstan, of course, which people have just heard a lot about in terms of the attempted coup there, and then the various other stands, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and so on. So we just put that up so that persons who want to make sure they're at least thinking about the area, the geostrategic importance of it, have seen it. Okay, so Helga, let me first of all go to you and see if you have any response to what you've heard as a whole, and then I'll go and begin to ask the questions.
Well, I think that the perspective of needing to find common grounds and get out of this crisis is so obvious. And I would really hope that the questions address that need and that we can elaborate it further.
Okay, very good. So let me just go pretty much in order. So this is a question from Renat, who just asked this. Who will fight the oligarchs? Poor people without money? Weapons are controlled and bought with money. We can't fight nukes with sticks. That's what it is. Now, of course, Paul sort of touched on it, but anybody want to take that question?
Well,
Yes.
I can say one thing about it. In the beginning of the 80s, in the middle range missile crisis, when the SS-20 and the Pershing II were with a warning time of only, I think, less than 6 minutes or so, you had 300,000 people in one demonstration in Bonn alone protesting the danger of World War III. And the so-called peace movement, I mean, that's people who are at least aware of the fact that world wars can happen and did happen. They have been sleeping for the whole time. And I think that in the recent period, especially in the recent weeks, when this war drum was beaten about the so-called Russian troops massing at the Ukraine border, I think there is a renewed perception about the war danger. And I would not be so pessimistic, because right now you have a whole bunch of so-called intelligentsia, professors, students, concerned people, different social organizations who are waking up. You have even former generals and diplomats raising this in letters. And I think this can become a growing debate. And I think that the way to respond to this is not to look like, the rabbit to the snake and say, oh, I'm so small, these oligarchs are so powerful, because it's not. I mean, remember that what led to the collapse of the GDR was the peaceful revolution. You had, many, many people, actually millions in the streets. And, there came a point where, the system just did not continue because it collapsed. Now, I think this is different because naturally in the United States the violence potential is much bigger, and also the situation is much more complex than it was even in '89. But you can have a popular uprising, and if we inject not only the concern, but also the solutions, I think it could lead to a very fruitful debate. And this is why I think this idea of a new security architecture is really, I'm going to write something. I'm actually in the process of writing something more elaborated on it. I think that is really what we have to do, because people want to have solutions. And, Richard just mentioned the Operation Ibn Sina. I have been pushing and hoping even before the Taliban took over, that if we would get an international cooperation among all the neighbors of Afghanistan, the Central Asian republics, Pakistan, Iran, but also Russia, China, India, who all have an interest to stabilize the situation and then win over people from the United States and from Europe to collaborate to address this worst humanitarian crisis on the planet, that this could be a stepping stone to forge a collaboration on a larger strategic level. And I'm still absolutely convinced that this is a right idea. So rather than saying I'm small and everything is so bad, join us and become active, because I think that if we get a good debate about solutions like a new Bretton Woods system, like economic recovery, like we said 1.5 billion jobs have to be created if we want to have a world health system. These are concrete things which, if they are being picked up by the people in motion right now, I think people will get much more optimistic and see that, because of the nature of human beings, that I would say that 99.9% of the people are good and only 0.1% are incurable.
Okay. All right. So the next, go ahead. Sorry.
Actually, I'd just like to say something on that to add to what Helga is saying, because there's another flank, which is that was developed initially by Lyndon LaRouche back in 1982 with the idea of the debt bomb. And his proposal to Mexico's President López Portillo nearly triggered a collapse at that time of the whole International Monetary Fund conditionalities regime imposed on nations. Now, today we're dealing with a debt crisis that's much, much larger. And as Paul indicated, the strategy of the oligarchs is to go with the Great Reset, the Green New Deal, which are clearly policies that will kill large numbers of people. The solution to this is what Lyndon LaRouche pushed for many, many years, but is now there as LaRouche's 4 laws, the bankruptcy reorganization of this system. And it can be done through legislation that's already worked. The Glass-Steagall bill, Hamiltonian credit system. And we're seeing in parts of the world, particularly in Eurasia, that they're not experiencing the same collapse that we are in the West. In fact, their economies are growing based on the traditions of the American system. They're not going to submit to this Great Reset and Green New Deal. So the American people have to realize we have allies all over the world. In fact, the 2 biggest allies we have in this are the ones that are being attacked by the neocons, Russia and China. We in the United States, instead of falling into this anti-Russia, anti-China policy, ought to learn from what they're doing and learn from our own history and LaRouche's policies and enforce on every candidate running for office that they join us with the LaRouche's 4 laws, starting with Glass-Steagall, bankruptcy reorganization, and so on. That's how you bring down the oligarchy without firing a shot.
Okay, so next question is from Kynan. He says, thank you all for your important presentations. It's clear that the cause of the conflict between the West and Russia is the financial and economic breakdown of the transatlantic system. The long-term agreements which Putin has proposed to the U.S. are absolutely needed to guarantee peace, along with the arms agreements, but a reordering of the global security architecture is the only way to get out of this crisis. Can the Belt and Road Initiative be the jump starter to this new process of mutual cooperation and collaboration? Many nations are a part of that, along with Syria, who has just joined. If the United States joined that process, could that be the foundation for a new security architecture? So I think this is mainly, Helga, directed to you, and then anyone else who wants to also comment.
Well, I think it is very clear that any kind of security architecture can only hold if the underlying basis of it is a joint economic interest. Because if the economic interest is, of the different parties is different, the alliance is not very stable. And one place where you can see that right now is in NATO, because the insistence of the United States and the British that Nord Stream 2 must be cancelled goes so much against the fundamental interest of Germany and 12 other European countries that it causes a serious friction, and that is just one. If you look at the East-West tensions within the EU on the refugee question, North-South on the question of austerity imposed on the South, you can see that the lack of economic cohesion is what undermines all alliances, be it military or economic or political. So therefore, if one constructs a new security architecture, which is supposed to be stable, the economic collaboration and economic win-win situation is the precondition for it to function. And I think that is, it's all there. I mean, China, for example, has offered to the United States many times a special new great power relation, which is based on mutual respect for the sovereignty, respect for the other social system, and more such principles. And the United States has really never responded to that. But that would be a model how, let's say, the interest of large nations and also smaller nations can be balanced against each other, and it can all lead to a fruitful cooperation where, I mean, we had a recent interview with Chess Freeman, who said it very simple. He said, why should the United States be concerned about China building fast train systems all over the world? Let American cars drive, or let American trains ride over them. Or why should we be concerned about Chinese airports? Let American airplanes land and have trade and commerce with the respective countries. So there is I mean, if you look at the need of humanity, Africa, the migrant question, the unemployment, the shadow economy, the famine, the pandemic, the general collapse of civil order in many countries around the world, there are so many tasks that if the large nations would say, let's collaborate and let's put concrete initiatives on the table to address these issues, it would be, I mean, right now, the United States is losing friends because of the policies which were cited by Harley and by Paul. If the United States would decide to join hands with these other large powers, the whole world would be so happy and go back to the idea of wanting to be absolute friends with the United States. So I think, there needs to be a discussion about that because of the absolute streamlined media. Most people do not know how other nations think, what their culture is. And, I think that can all be remedied. And, the Schiller Institute is trying to have as many venues to do that. Others must join. But I think, if we would forge such an economic cooperation on a win-win basis, a security architecture would be very easy to establish. And I think even the military-industrial complex could do something useful rather than building weapons which will be destroyed and which are actually, over the long run, a tremendous destruction of physical value of a society. You could go into fast train building, into space technology, into so many areas. So basically, even the military-industrial complex could win more in the long run and by helping to create peace. So a little rethinking is required.
Okay. Anybody else want to answer that or say anything? Paul, go ahead.
I mean, that's really perfect. There's just one other thing that could be added to it in terms of this presentation at the World Economic Forum conference that Xi Jinping, president of China, just gave. The central banks of the transatlantic countries have created a roaring inflation. Everybody knows that, can see it now, and is feeling it. The next step, some people think, will be that those same banks will start to raise interest rates sharply in 2022. I don't think they will, but I think they will raise interest rates slightly in 2022. But whether it's sharply or slightly, that is going to whack the economies of developing countries. It's going to make capital fly out of those countries. It's going to devalue their currencies. And they've already taken tremendous damage of the last 2 years. The IMF has warned about this. The World Bank has warned about this just in the last few days. So I thought it was very notable that President Xi Jinping went into the lion's den, so to speak, the World Economic Forum, the Davos conference, and he spoke very specifically about what needed to be done in the way of economic cooperation. And he said, we have to avoid any kind of monetary policy, credit policy, which involves wild fluctuations in one direction and then in the other of suddenly raising interest rates. And he came very close to specifically talking about a system of deliberate cooperation among major powers in their lending and their credit and their monetary policies. So then you take a look at the Chinese banks. How much additional lending did they do in 2021? 11.7% increase in their loans outstanding, and that's all over the world. Then you look at the whole banking system in the United States. How much additional lending did it do in 2021? Its loans outstanding grew by something under 0.5%, while its deposits grew by more than $2 trillion. So you have function and dysfunction, and obviously to make a new credit and monetary system to the evident advantage of the United States, of Americans, let's say not those Wall Street banks, but to the evident advantage of Americans, would be to get those banks lending and therefore set specific targets for development in the world and for rescuing completely war-destroyed countries, above all Afghanistan, Yemen, to rescue those things with lending. Otherwise, the central banks have been for 10 years throwing reserves at the big banks and saying, we'd really like you to make some loans to the real economy. The banks don't even respond. They don't even promise, let alone do any of it. This takes this kind of agreement among major nations that we're going to say what we have to make new credit for, what we have to do to bring up the general welfare of the population of the world as a whole after this 2 years of real collapse. And that, I thought, was really there in what Xi Jinping was saying. We will publish some very big excerpts from what he said there at the World Economic Forum in the issue of EIR that comes out in this coming week.
Okay. Richard, you had your hand up before. Did you want to say anything? Or
Yeah,
go ahead.
I just wanted to point kind to the fact that there are new developments afoot which have tremendous potential. The China-Russia economic collaboration, which they've defined as the highest level of collaboration. You think of LaRouche's characterization of Russia as a nation of science. What China is doing today in science, this is really a new historic force. Putin was recently in India, signed a couple of dozen agreements. India has committed to do massive development of oil and gas in Siberia. Eastern Russia continues to be undeveloped. This is really a great frontier. So there's been talk coming out of the recent discussions of a possible Russia-India China summit. So there are all kinds of new developments afoot. As well, there is at least discussion of the fact that the current international monetary system won't function to support what's actually needed. I recently read a report from the Russian International Affairs Council on China-Russia cooperation in Africa, and the whole topic was the emergency development of Africa. Here's what they say in part of the report. It is impossible to modernize African states successfully without reforming the international economic system and its constituent institutions. A new grand bargain between the global North and the global South is required, primarily serving Africa's interests. They say the necessary prerequisite for achieving this is for the international system to transition to a radically new and higher level of global governance. This is only to say that this question that a new international monetary system is required is now a major topic of discussion in Russia, in China, and coming from Schiller Institute friends around the globe. So there are new developments afoot which make new possibilities a potential reality.
Okay, now we're getting a lot of questions, and I think that's good. I'm also going to try to prioritize them in terms of new people or people that are clearly asking for the first time. Just wanted everybody to know that. This question is from Michael. It's sort of a proposal, really, also that just wants to hear what Helga thinks of this. And he says, an obvious flank or a possible flank to the war danger, this is now on the question of Ukraine, might be to increase supplies of wheat for the immediate needs of Afghanistan. And the question was actually intended for the Russian representative, from Mr. Polyansky, or anyone else who had the knowledge. And he says, the blue in the flag of Ukraine represents its beautiful skies. The gold symbolizes its seemingly over the horizon endless fields of wheat. Why not propose a real cooperation potential, like Lynn did regarding real development potentials of Poland at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, and suggest that an effort be made for Ukrainian wheat to be mobilized for needs in Afghanistan? And just otherwise asked whether or not he doesn't know, whether wheat fields are there or so on. So that was the idea that he was asking about. Any comment on that?
Well, I don't know if it's practical, but we have some very important economists like Natalia Vitrenko, who I'm going to ask if she thinks this is a possible development. In general, the approach is absolutely correct, because, I just had a discussion earlier today with somebody else who told me that in his group, there is a complete disunity and factionalization, and people don't agree on things. I said, well, maybe they should look above or beyond the rim of their plate. They should take the larger issue, because, whenever you have a conflict which seems to be unsolvable, like the Ukraine situation is very difficult, I must admit, because of the manipulations, the historic roots, and many things. But sometimes, even if you have a very desperate situation, if you give somebody or a group of people a completely different task, like in that case, helping Afghanistan, not without compensation, because Ukraine is in a terrible economic crisis. Their health system is completely collapsing. In the previous period, they were forced to sell some of the extremely fertile soil. Ukraine has, probably together with Sudan, the most fertile soil of the planet. And they were forced to sell that black soil to oligarchs outside. So that's why I'm saying one has to look at the concrete situation. But if there would be, let's say, an international sponsorship where people would reimburse Ukrainian farmers to go into a massive increase of wheat production because of the famine in the world, of which David Beasley is talking that it's of biblical dimension, that could indeed bring a new element, but that would require really governments. I think that the situation in Ukraine is even more difficult because of the internal, the difference between the West and the East. It's a complicated question. I think it could work. I think the approach is correct, that if you have a seemingly unsolvable problem, give all fighting parties a task which is leading them to an approach to help somebody else. And I think that element of what you're saying is absolutely correct, but I think it needs a little bit more investigation because it has a lot of complications to it. But in general, the thinking is absolutely right.
Okay, I'm going to take two questions here. I think you'll see that they're related. And they are first one is from Carlos, and he asked this question. How to understand the fact that Western elites want to have control over the world with a unipolar approach, but yet destroy their own economic base with speculation, inflation, unemployment, poverty, and famine. How do you want power and yet weaken yourself? So that's his question. That's Carlos's question. Franz is asking a different question. His question is this. He says, I'm watching your discussion on the emerging conflict between USA, Ukraine, and Russia, and I'm curious what you foresee for the US economy if an armed conflict with Ukraine were to start. Could the US handle another war given the ongoing shortages due to the pandemic and inflation? Are there other ways a war like this will play a role in the daily lives of Americans? So those are the two questions, and I'm going to pose them. Helga, you want to go first, or
Well, I just want to touch upon the last one first by just saying that it is the opinion of several analysts that if it would come to a full-fledged war between Russia and Ukraine, open-ended, if it involves the West in general, NATO, the crash of the system is guaranteed. I think the fragility of the financial system is such that would be more likely than not the trigger point for a complete meltdown of the system. Even more sanctions against Russia, like cutting it off from the SWIFT agreement. The new head of the CDU in Germany said this is the nuclear option. It would completely detonate the Western capital markets. So we are sitting on a powder keg in that respect, absolutely. And the second question, maybe somebody else wants to answer.
okay, which was how to understand that Western elites at the same time want to have a unipolar approach, and yet at the same point they're destroying themselves.
Well, I think
Okay, Paul, go ahead.
we can not only understand it, but perhaps be happy about it. But the policy is not at all mysterious. What I started out with earlier, that a system which was designed at the end of the World War II in order to reconstruct and reindustrialize around the world, that is to direct direct surplus and credit into new capital goods, high technology capital goods, into capital goods exports from the more advanced countries, and both to the losing countries in the war, the countries that have been destroyed significantly in the war, and also to developing countries. They called it reconstruction and development. That Bretton Woods system was specifically aimed at suppressing speculation, suppressing the movement of capital from what you would call the oligarchy or the elites, moving capital for speculative purposes around the world and limiting it to increasing the productivity, the powers of production of the human race. That system was destroyed quite deliberately at the instigation of City of London banks through the 1960s. Lyndon LaRouche spoke and wrote about it constantly during the 1960s and forecast that this could lead to its destruction at the end of that decade, and it did. Now, as soon as you are in a monetary system as we have been in since then, since 1973, really, in which speculation is incentivized and is more profitable than investment in new real physical production, then you will have a system which of investment which constantly weakens the underlying economy that it's sitting upon, whilst in its own view making a great deal of profit. The so-called Green New Deal is the latest and most extreme twist in pouring investment out of what are now veteran technologies, but nonetheless very productive ones, very indebted ones, pouring investment out of those into backward, less productive, less energy dense technologies like wind power, solar power, and so on. This clearly is a weakening. The most ideological ecologists rather, know that it's a weakening, and they say the objective is to reduce the human population. So what's that if not the result of the weakening of the economies underneath? But that's the policy which this oligarchy is now trying to make super profitable. That's what I was trying to describe earlier in the presentation. So in doing so, they have weakened themselves. They have at the same time driven themselves towards trying to confront, even militarily confront, Russia and China, which have actually been getting economically and scientifically and technologically stronger at the same time. That's a situation in which many people can mobilize and say, get back from that precipice. You're going to destroy us. So that weakening is important.
Okay, what I want to do here is we got several more questions, so we're going to try to, again, in this case, I'm going to throw this one, a request that maybe Richard, you and Harley might want to deal with this one. I've got another question for Helga, so I'm going to read these. So Johan asks questions, well, it's a two-part question, which is, what is the analysis of the Schiller Institute regarding the evolution of the military strategies generated by the invention of hypersonic glide vehicles like the Russian device Avangard? And what are the propositions of the Schiller Institute to reduce the number of nuclear weapons worldwide? So I just think I'm sort of throwing that in the direction of Richard and Harley. Helga, there was a question that was asked here by Cade, and he says this: 90 tons of lethal aid were recently shipped to Ukraine by the U.S. Donald Trump's first impeachment was directly over stopping this kind of aid, which was to be used against the Donbass region. With the recent report about leaked documents concerning the U.S.'s request to keep any written security guarantees to Russia secret, are we witnessing a buildup by what Ray McGovern calls the Mickey Mat to, which is a military, industrial, media, academic complex, etc., to similarly threaten Biden with impeachment if he's insufficiently hawkish against Ukraine, as when he was called treasonous by a British general for withdrawing from Afghanistan. So the idea is that what we're actually watching happen here? So those are the two questions, if you want. One is the two-part one just about the weapons and what's happened there and what our proposals are on reducing the number of nuclear weapons, and the other on this question of what may be being placed in store for the Biden administration. So who would like to start?
I can just say a couple of points on that. Look, the development of the hypersonic capability by Russia is, in a sense, a game changer, because this was not foreseen by the U.S. military, and the U.S. is having problems replicating it. So this has become one aspect of a change which may, in fact, have a lot to do with the fact that the West is escalating their rhetoric against Russia. If you think about what Lyndon LaRouche talked about with the SDI, the Ogarkov doctrine in the mid-'80s, the Russians realized that as the United States economy was advancing and developing these new weapon systems, the Russians were having a closed window of opportunity if they were going to strike toward the West. Now, if with the emergence and development of the Russian military and the Chinese military and an alliance between the two of them, all military strategy is thrown out the window. There's discussion among generals and others about how we no longer have to plan for war against Russia or China, but possibly against both. Which brings us to the second point. Arms negotiations, while they've been somewhat helpful in the past, aren't a solution, because you end up with the question of being able to supervise, to be able to verify, and more importantly, the reducing a certain number of killer weapons still leaves a large number, large enough to destroy the whole planet. The real question is building the trust and cooperation that makes nations realize they no longer should be spending money on these weapons. And this is the whole idea, if you think about extending the Belt and Road Initiative as a basis of foreign policy, as a basis of development, that you would achieve what Xi Jinping calls the win-win. Not only are you peacefully developing your neighbors, but you're providing a basis for security where the benefit of the other is also to your benefit, and therefore doing harm to the other would harm you. And so the solution is not necessarily endless arms control and debate over which weapon system should be outlawed, but actually achieving a real substantive basis for peace through economic development.
Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, what's the connection between Russia developing these hypersonic weapons before the United States and Mr. LaRouche's characterization in 2001 of Russia as a nation of science? In fact, the Russian Academy of Sciences was founded almost 300 years ago. The United States could combine readily its scientific brilliance with that of Russia, as we did in the 60s in the Apollo-Soyuz joint space program, as President Kennedy had proposed joint development of the moon. So if we were wise, we would look at the brilliance of Russian science, its accomplishment over hundreds of years, and say we should join our unique American efforts with that. And as I said earlier in my remarks, there is a great amount of precedence for that in America's history. That's what we should do.
Okay. Helga?
Well, I think, the recent freak out when President Biden made this remark that if there is only a minor incursion into Ukraine on the side of Russia, that would not require a full set of measures, or some formulation like that. There was a huge freak out by many people, and then the State Department found it necessary to immediately correct the President of the United States. And today the main tabloid in Germany, Bild Zeitung, they always have a column winner and loser. And today the winner, according to them, is Blinken, because he was able to correct the mistake of the President of the United States. I mean, that gives you a sense of how this works. In general, there are a lot of responsible people who think, from their knowing Biden and studying what he has been doing, that Biden personally does not want war with Russia or China. If he's going wisely about it is another question, but he is for sure not the warmonger in this present administration, but there are some. And I had many discussions. We were pushing for many years this idea that in order to deal with the empire, the British Empire, but also more genetically the empire of the oligarchy, that we need a four-power summit, that only if the four most important and most powerful nations in terms of economics, population, military power, that only if they would unite, that they could impose policies which would, basically put the empire into, put it into defeated. That would be the United States, Russia, China, and India. And many people I talked with, let's say in Russia, in China, in other countries, they said, well, even if the president of the United States would agree with what you are saying at such a summit, he would go home and he would immediately be, opposed by the establishment, by the establishment inside the Beltway, the Wall Street, the Silicon Valley, the military-industrial complex, and there is a grain of salt in it. What do you do about it? You do exactly what we discussed before. You have to build people who fight for solutions, and I think that is something. We are going into a period which will be, I think, the most turbulent in our lifetime for sure, because this system cannot hold. And Xi Jinping always talks about that we are in a period of changes as they not have been seen in 100 years. Now, obviously, he refers, among other things, to the collapse of the last Chinese dynasty and the emergence of China as a republic. But worldwide, it pertains to the changes of the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, World War I. So we are in such a period, either we get a peaceful reorganization of the bankrupt system and the kind of discussion with a new financial and also security architecture, and it can be done in a peaceful way. And I think we need a lot of discussion about that. We need the social media to be used for such a discussion. We need plenums in universities, we need symposiums, we need an activation of anybody to discuss what should be the world of the 21st century, and do we want to give ourselves a global governance, a global system of relations among nations which allows for the survival of all human beings on this planet and have a good life, a happy life, which is the basic right of all human beings to have exactly that. And what does it require? So I think that, we go into a period of financial blowout of the system, of, breaking of stable situations. I'm not so certain that the EU, for example, will outlive the next year or years, because the internal tensions in the EU are so incredibly strong. If you have Ursula von der Leyen, for example, who is trying to force Hungary to accept the education of the LBGT, whatever it's called. And the Hungarians are saying, no, we want to keep family values, and we do not want this kind of interference in our internal education system. This is, for Hungary, a very big issue. And there are many, many more such issues. So all I'm saying is we are in a period of absolute turmoil where institutions disintegrate. And, in a certain sense, the whole world is called upon, what is the moral fiber of the human species to deal with these challenges? And, I think that the Schiller Institute is a platform where people can have these kinds of discussions, because we have been working on solutions since 50 years. So we are the solution people. We are not only the book people, as Ramsey Clark said, but we are also the solution people. And if you want to contribute to come out of this crisis, then join our efforts.
Okay, what I want to do is to have, essentially, there's three more questions. I'm going to try to assign those, and then there's a final question which I'm going to direct to people, and you can give sort of final remarks also as we go to that. You'll see why I'm doing this. First, we have a question, and it's from unknown. Normally, we don't take that, but we're going to do that today. And here's what unknown is asking. I think it's going to be directed toward you, Helga. It says, David Pine, as an example of current thinking, is indeed alarmed by the danger of war between Russia and China. Yet a January 1st paper by Pine proposes his version of a new security architecture, but it appears to be an attempt to maintain the same current bankrupt system. While crisis, okay, so then it says, number one, in exchange for Russia leaving the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, U.S. and Russia would sign a free trade agreement. This would ensure Russia enjoyed, and he says more about that. So this is a return to the policies that nearly destroyed Russia in the 1990s. Okay? Hardly a good deal for the Russians. Number two, the USA and Russia should sign an agreement to share anti-ballistic missile technologies, which Pine deliberately misattributes to Putin. Says some more there. I'm not going to go through all of this because you'll see why. And then three, the USA would adopt a Fortress America policy to deploy new offensive technologies with no proposal to rebuild anybody's physical economies. No proposals to reverse physical collapse, ignoring the potential of China's Belt and Road, just arm waving and failure to address the real economy. Would any of the panelists, it actually says, to address the apparent emotional and cultural refusal to face issues of physical economy versus free trade, the collapse of which ensures USA and Europe continue to physically collapse? So that's the first one. The second question is from Kathy, and it says, this question is primarily for Harley or Richard, but really any of the panelists. Ambassador Polyansky made a reference to the Minsk agreements, but I don't think most Americans have much idea of what the Minsk agreements are, except the narrative that Russia is A, violating them, and B, needs to come back to negotiations of them. Could you explain what the truth of these agreements are? So there's that question. And then the final one, which really, I'm going to give this to Paul, but maybe others would want to say something. It's from Renee, and she says, isn't it the case that the war-embedded economy, the so-called military-industrial complex, the buildup of major cartels for military production around the 1996 LTCM financial crisis, and the subsequent privatization of the military have created a war-based economy where the dollar is accepted as a reserve currency because the United States is the primary nuclear power in the world? I think nuclear military power in the world. The question is, why is the hyperinflation accepted by the whole transatlantic world? So that's the array that we're dealing with here. Maybe the simplest one is the Minsk agreements. Is that the case? Do you guys want to just talk about that?
Well, I can take that.
Okay.
I mean, the main thing on the Minsk agreement is that this was negotiated through the Normandy format, which was Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia. And one of the problems is that Ukraine, actually, it wasn't Russia that walked away, it was Ukraine that walked away. Ukraine is not negotiating. And the Russians are somewhat upset that the Germans and French have not enforced it, have not moved to push it. Now, the key to it was to solve the problem in the Donbas region, which are primarily Russian language, Russian ethnic populations who were immediately assaulted with these new laws right after the coup in 2014 that had to do with their ability to have a say in national policy, language laws, and so on. And so the question was posed in the Normandy talks of autonomy, a certain amount of autonomy in a federal system for those regions. Kiev would not negotiate that. Also, there's a provision in the Minsk agreement that Kiev must not adopt laws which contradict the Minsk agreement. And Kiev has been consistently provoking a sense of panic in the Russian ethnic populations, which plays into the whole confrontation going on there. So the real issue on the Minsk agreement is that this was something that was worked out in, I think, 2015. It's never been finalized from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians are saying they're not going to negotiate with people from the republics or the areas, Luhansk and Donetsk. They want to negotiate directly with Russia, and the Russians are saying you have to talk to the people who live there. So that's really all it's about, but it's an example of using an issue to provoke Russia. That's the way the Ukrainians are doing it, and that's when the U.S. is supporting them on that. They're essentially saying that they're giving the Ukrainians the benefit of not negotiating so they can blame it on the Russians. This area is an extremely dangerous area because there are now reports of British special forces, Canadian special forces coming in, training the Ukrainian army, which half of the Ukrainian army is now deployed along the Dnieper River, which is the dividing line between these two areas and the Kiev-controlled part of Ukraine. And that the danger of a provocation, especially since embedded in the Ukrainian security and defense forces are neo-Nazis who have a long history of ethnic cleansing in the territory of Ukraine. So the Minsk agreement and the Normandy format remains an important issue. And in fact, in Putin's initial drafts, it includes some language on the importance of enforcing Ukraine to recognize Kiev, to recognize and act on the Minsk agreement.
Okay. Rich, you want to add anything or just let that suffice?
That's fine.
Okay, we'll go with that. Very good. Paul, do you want to take Renee's question up?
Well, I'll take it up. I mean, I don't know that I have in mind the whole of it, but I think it's certainly the case that the 1990s, the 1990s followed what the Wall Street and other oligarchs and their academic thinkers in the United States considered to be the end of history, as one of them, Fukuyama, put it. That now the Cold War was over, there was only one power, and therefore that power could do whatever, especially in economic and financial terms, absolutely whatever it wanted to any other country, and it could do whatever it wanted to its own economy and its own population, for that matter, because there was no other power in the world. And one aspect of that, as you indicated, was the military. It was military budgets actually fell during that period, but they didn't really fall because there was a great deal of farming out, privatization of military functions, what had previously been military functions, to private corporations, which profited dramatically as a result. There was a general abandonment of any sense need to push the frontiers of science. Even DARPA, which had been directed around the laser industrial revolution potential, which Lyndon LaRouche had talked about in the 80s. In the 90s, it very infamously picked up and then dropped hypersonic weapon development, and it wasn't picked up again for more than a decade until they saw alarming signs elsewhere. And in addition, there was this obsession or fantasy about IT, the information technology revolution, that this was the way to have fingertip control of processes all over the world. And this was the future, the IT, which has turned out to be the only major technological revolution, if you call it that, in history, which had no effect on productivity whatsoever. If anything, it lowered productivity, and economists since 2010 in particular have started to publish studies recognizing that that the IT revolution was a net negative, has been a net negative for the economy. So you have all these things going on in terms of the abandonment of scientific and technological progress, of the dedication of major universities to scientific and technological progress, and of the feeling of necessity in the military that the frontiers of science and technology should be being pushed all the time. That all went by the board. So then, not surprisingly, speculation flourished even further. You had this bankruptcy in 1999 of this, at that time, very large hedge fund, LTCM, which was leveraged with debt to a degree that nobody had ever seen before. It was speculative to a magnitude that was just inconceivable. And yet, when it failed, the Federal Reserve pulled together all the big banks and said, save it, or else you're going yourself. And they had to save it. And that was really, with Glass-Steagall gone, that was really the signpost pointing towards the complete explosion in 2008 and the so-called Great Recession, which has really not ended since then. So it was a tremendous step backward, and what was being done to the military at that time was certainly a leading feature of it, which they have had plenty of cause to regret since then.
Okay, so Helga, the question from unknown. You want to take that?
Yeah, I think I did read the same article you referred to, and I think it's still full of geopolitical thinking. It has this scheme that if the US makes a friendship treaty with Russia, and if then Russia is pulled out of the SCO, it's really this old idea that the aim has to be to split Russia and China, either by making friends with Russia against China or the other way around. And I think this, first of all, will not function. It is my deepest conviction that these policies of the West have created a situation where previously existing conflicts between Russia and China have really been overcome, and that these two countries have now formed a friendship which is unshakable. Naturally, the efforts to split them are continuously going on, but following the evolution of the strengthening of the relationship between Russia and China for quite some time now, I think it has reached a quality which cannot be destroyed unless you have World War III and everything is destroyed. So I think this is still the old thinking of trying to get geopolitical solutions and so forth. I think what is required is a completely different approach. You need a new paradigm in thinking, and most people have a very hard time to think a new paradigm. But it's not so difficult when you think that there is in each great tradition and culture, there are principles which pertain to the to the evolution of the cosmos. In European philosophy, it was called or is called natural law. In other cultures, it's called cosmological order or similar notions. But it pertains to something that there are deeper laws than positivist laws which are made by man. And these are the laws which are inherent in Christian terms in the creation, or in religious terms in the creation, or in scientific terms in the physical universe, and the principles embedded in that physical universe. And I think that if we come to an agreement, then these physical principles of our real existing universe must be reflected, because we cannot create a political order without paying attention to the laws of the physical universe. And I think one of the more exciting developments of the recent period was the putting into space of the James Webb telescope, which will be functioning by June of this year. And then we will know a lot more things about at least the last almost 14 billion years of history, where supposedly the Big Bang of the universe occurred. And then I think we will find very fascinating things, that maybe the Big Bang was not the beginning of the physical universe. In any case, we will find out a lot more about the nature of our universe. And I think that will also inspire people to think, how can we make our political order on this planet more in cohesion to the larger universe in which we find ourselves? So I think the new paradigm has to go in directions which are very, very much different than a geopolitical rearrangement of this alliance or that alliance. So I think it's much more challenging and much more exciting.
Okay, I just wanted to find something out here. Sorry. So one of the young people who is watching this had asked the question why we were using the maps, why we put a map up, and an exchange happened in the chat room. Said, well, because a lot of Americans don't know where these things are, and then this person posted something from Ed Snowden, who said, true story, the CIA station I worked at in Europe had an enormous wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling world map, because even career intelligence officers often had no idea where country X was located. The number of new arrivals who confused Sweden and Switzerland would astonish you. I will note, however, that was an exchange that happened at 2:30 today. Okay, so here's the final question, and it's really it's so people should give final remarks to this, I think, and then will be our conclusion. So this one is from Steve, and he says, to the distinguished panel, people acknowledge the broken promise concerning the aggressive NATO expansion. Some say that it was dishonorable to break it, and others counter that it was not legally binding, so it was technically lawful. What seems to be ignored entirely by most relevant diplomats is that the promise to not expand NATO's borders helped to secure the peaceful reunification of Germany in particular, and therefore world peace in general. What if John Kennedy, had broken his promise to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey after the missiles crisis? How do we honor, this is the question part, how do we honor natural law above contracts, especially since we know that any further treaties, formally binding or not, will only succeed if motivated by natural law? Thank you all for your invaluable contributions to world peace. So that's the question. And obviously you can take up any portion of it or whatever, but I would also just ask that people do a kind of conclusion of your remarks. So Richard, I'm going to go to you first.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. I would just ask any of our viewers today who are not members of the Schiller Institute to join. Get our weekly newsletter, get our new extraordinary philosophical journal, Leonora, and in that way be informed. There really is no other way of being informed. And then, being informed, you can get active. I'll give you an example of how you're likely not informed. And this goes to the question that Dennis brought up at our beginning and Lyndon's discussion at the Martin Luther King event in terms of leadership. One of the extraordinary leaders in international affairs today is the president of China, Xi Jinping. And at the UN last September, at the General Assembly, he made an extraordinary proposal, which probably most people listening today don't know anything about. He called for something new, a Global Development Initiative, the GDI. And it was very specific, and he went through 6 points whereby global development could be moved forward rapidly, given the global crisis. And implicitly, it included harsh criticisms of the UN as being ineffectual on the question of the needs of people. And Xi Jinping has again and again emphasized what he calls a people-centered approach. And this global development initiative is being discussed among nations, and in the Chinese press, they're elucidating it quite clearly. Do Americans know anything about this? Do Europeans know anything about this? Absolutely not. And part of Xi Jinping's leadership of continually coming up with initiative after initiative is also his sense of humor, as reflected in this people-centered approach. That's the Chinese term. And just at the beginning of the week, when he spoke at Klaus Schwab's outfit, the Davos crowd, he said anybody that wants to push a policy of ecology without tending to the rising benefits and of the people is like someone climbing a tree to catch a fish. So here you have on the global strategic stage individuals such as Xi Jinping, President Putin, who really are world thinkers. And if you want to find out about it, you look to the US press, the media, TV, even the internet. You're not going to find anything out about it. And that's what the Schiller Institute has developed over decades. So I just want to take my minute to ask people to join, get active, read, and learn. Thanks, Dennis.
Okay, great. Paul, you're editor of EIR, one of the co-editors. You probably have something to say along that line too.
Well, okay, I'm not sure which line you mean, but to the question, it's a good one. But John F. Kennedy was a president who was committed, as everybody who knows much about his presidency knows, he was firmly committed to scientific, technological development, economic progress, not only for this country, but to seeing if he could generalize it to the welfare of other countries as well. This is a president who wanted at one point and proposed a joint mission to the moon with the Soviet Union. So the question of, given what he stood for, which was, at least as far as he understood it, the general welfare of the United States, while considering the interests of other countries, the question of what would have happened had he not gone through with removing the missiles from Turkey, it seems to me it doesn't really exist. He was going to, he made a promise, he was going to carry it out. That was part of his leadership and part of what he did in attempting to bring an end to the arms race in the little time that remained to him. So with that kind of leadership, he was going to do what he said in ending the Cuban Missiles Crisis. And there's a big, big contrast to the promises that were made that NATO would not expand. Because I think from the British point of view, and I guess joined at that time by Mitterrand, the president of France, but from the British point of view, these were promises intended to be lies made to Germany as well as to Russia in order to get Germany to accept the British version of what would be allowed in unification. The British did not want Germany to be unified at all in 1989 and 1990, and really neither did George H.W. Bush. So they made some rather dirty deals in which those promises made by Germany to Russia at that time were undoubtedly meant sincerely, but not from London. So that ever since then there has been a drastic difference in terms of the commitment to peace with Russia on the part of Germany as opposed to Britain and at times the United States. And you see it right now where the British prepare lethal weapons for Ukraine and they fly them up over through Danish airspace and then down into Ukraine because they don't want to ask Germany for permission to fly over Germany because they don't want to hear Germany deny it because Germany does not want those lethal weapons going into Ukraine right now. So this is really a question of leadership and in particular British versus British at the worst and American leadership when it has been at the best, as in the case of Kennedy in this period, and what such promises mean when coming from one sort of leadership or another.
Okay, very good. Harley?
This is an interesting question because we're so far from natural law governing the relations between nations. And if you look at the argument that since it was never in writing, it really wasn't binding, that's a classic sleazy lawyer's explanation. And that falls far below natural law or even law as it should be practiced in the courtroom. Now, this is typical, though, of the way the unipolar world is operating because it's not based on law. The idea of a rules-based order is outside of the international law as put into the writing in the UN Charter, international treaty obligations. So the US and NATO countries are not even abiding by the laws that they've signed. And the Russians have made this point that they want legally binding written agreements that can be verified. Now, I just want to call attention to one very ominous development in the last couple of days that will maybe give us a better reading of how serious the US is about backing up Ukraine. President Zelensky has been saying that there must be sanctions against Russia before an invasion. And that would be a way of deterring an attack. And the defense minister of Ukraine, Alexei Reznikov, was on the BBC the other morning, and he said that sanctions of really intense, tough, punishing sanctions might be the only thing that would prevent an invasion. And again, it shows the extent to which there's a delusional approach to this, because the sanction regimes have done nothing to bring about human rights. In fact, in many cases, sanctions are killing people, as in the case of Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, and they're certainly inflicting hardship on people in Russia. So, a written treaty, a legally binding treaty, is extremely important. But we really need to have the quality of leadership that Lynn was talking about with Martin Luther King, which actually goes above statutory principles to the very question of what is in the interests of the human race as a whole.
Okay, thank you. So Helga?
I think it has a lot to do with the kind of foreign policy one agrees upon or pushes, because if you have an empire, then it goes with the rules of the empire that it is allowed to impose the force of the empire by coups, by color revolution, by regime change, by subversion, by buying people up in the opposition to topple the government. I mean, all of that is really not worthy of the human species. If you have nation states, they should have a completely different relationship to each other. And that brings me to the question of why I founded the Schiller Institute in the first place. The title of the Schiller Institute is Institute for Statecraft. In German, the word is even better. It says Staatskunst, which means that the building of a state is a piece of art. And Schiller in the Aesthetical Letter says the highest freedom, the highest piece of art is the building of the political freedom, and to basically fulfill and develop the perfect state where all the citizens are contributing to the well-being of the state and vice versa. The state takes care of the well-being of the citizens. So this is really a very important concept because, when I founded the Schiller Institute, I said we need a new concept of foreign policy, because you cannot have anymore a situation where the strongest is bullying the weakest and taking advantage of everything that superior physical power gives them, but that you need a foreign policy in which each nation respects the best tradition of the other. For example, when I as a German are traveling around the world, which hopefully will come sometimes again after COVID, I don't want to be addressed as the person who comes from Nazi Germany. I want to be addressed as the person who comes from the country of poets and thinkers and inventors of, Nikolaus of Kues, of Leibniz, of Kepler, of Beethoven, of Schiller. So in the same way, when an American travels, you don't want to be addressed as the evil Yankee, or do you say Yankee, Janky or whatever, who committed all these crimes in Vietnam and on. But you want to be addressed as the person representing the greatest constitution in the planet, who made the revolution against the British Empire, who developed the American system of economy, and so forth and so on. With other words, you want to be addressed as the person who represents the best tradition. And I can guarantee you, if you talk to any of your neighbors and you say, oh, you have such an ugly nose, and your ears are completely too wide, and your dresses are ugly and you stink, and you keep talking like that, you can have World War III with the most peaceful person. Just try it out for fun. But if you, on the other side, address your neighbor with the idea, oh, you just wrote this beautiful article. Here is a suggestion, what next articles you can write to improve your creativity. Or, you just learned this new language. I have some suggestions how you can use that. Or, you can expand your capability in the following way. With other words, if you address the other person from bringing forward their potential, I mean, this person experience your love, and love will come back. And the same principle is among nations, that if you treat another nation by respecting the highest expression of their culture, then you get the same back. So, to have this bullying and subversion and coups, it really has to end. And this is why, we have always called that with the New World Economic Order and with the new architecture for security, for finance, there has to be a dialogue of cultures, because I'm convinced that the biggest crisis, and if we don't solve that crisis, we cannot win. We have to solve the cultural crisis. If you look around in the West, in the United States and in Europe in particular, we are in a dark age. We don't even know our classics anymore. People think, that the classical music is the Rolling Stones or something. I'm not kidding. I found young people who really have told me that. So I think what we need to do is to improve our culture. We have to go back to our best traditions and have a dialogue about that. Study, steep ourselves in the most beautiful poetry, best traditions of music, and then, inspire ourselves to make a new renaissance. Because I think if we don't do a new renaissance with the culture we have right now, we have lost the systemic competition already. So that is why the Schiller Institute from the very beginning said we need a new world economic order, but it can only function if it is combined with a beautiful renaissance of the best cultures of all over the world. And I think that is what, you should join.
All right. So Richard Black, Paul Gallagher, Harley Schlanger, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, want to thank you for being with us and presenting this. I want to just say to everybody that's just seen this, this is the minimum standard that we've just presented to you for a presentation of current history in the present crisis. This is what is going to be needed to get us out of this situation. We all know the problems, but the question is, do we know the solutions and the way to devise the solutions? It takes a culture of futurity, not a culture of futility. You can't have a situation where you expect to have the population capable of voting on things when they don't know, for example, the location of countries. Somebody sent us something that said the less people know about where Ukraine is, the more they want to intervene. And of course, that is an absurdity. And so what we want to do is say, look, you people should be proud of their immortality, proud of the cultures, as Helga just said, and the things that are great about the cultures from which we come. But the most important thing we could do is learn things we don't know. I want to just say that on this Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites, please go and look at that and look at the things that we're doing with that. Subscribe to the publication, the Executive Intelligence Review, join the Schiller Institute, and above all, take the program that you've just experienced and the method that behind it and reproduce it. There are many different ways to get in touch with us and to pursue that, and we hope that you will all take advantage of those ways. And so on behalf of the Schiller Institute and today's symposium, we want to thank you all for listening, and we'll see you all again.